All right. Well, I'm relatively certain it's a Monday, and certainly the weather feels like a Monday, at least for me. I
Happy
don't know about
Monday.
you,
It is
Chelsea,
a
but
very
yeah,
Monday. And Monday is here
yeah,
in Monday form.
yeah. It's freezing rain here in the Twin Cities. It's very exciting. I told my son
Freezing.
as I was driving him, yeah, because it's like 38 degrees or something like that. I don't know. I haven't looked at the weather app in a little while, but I would much rather have a foot of snow, which we got last week, than this quarter inch of freezing rain. But that's just me. To each their own. To each their own. So.
Here.
Good afternoon. I can say afternoon. It is afternoon now. I was almost going to say good morning, and then I
Oh,
realized that
it
it's
is.
not morning. So good afternoon, Chelsea. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing all right. How are you?
Well, other than the fact that it's Monday and raining, I'm feeling all right. Although my teenager gave me a cold, so I'm not loving
Oh
that
no.
because I
Mm,
basically haven't had a cold in like 3 years, so I forgot what colds were like, and but what are you
right.
gonna do,
It's weird getting sick the first time after we've been spending so much time indoors. It
right?
turns out that if you're wearing a mask everywhere and not really seeing people, you're able to avoid a lot of infectious diseases,
Yes, yes.
not
It's
just
it's
COVID.
amazing how that
And
works.
it's
Oh, well, good morning, Glenn. How are you, sir? Hey, you changed your handle here. Usually, I'm so used to seeing you come in with your hard to understand CFS. I'm blanking on your actual Twitter handle there, Glenn. But good morning, Glenn. So, well, Chelsea, I'm going to start where I always start, which is origin story. How did you get into this strange technology space? You and I were talking in the pre-show about our overlapping pasts, and so I'm always fascinated as to how, because everybody has a different way of how they got into tech. There's no
it's
like
true.
one way, and so I'm always curious, how folks devolve into this space. So what led you? What poor life choices led you to where you are today?
Oh man, what happened? Well, so I went to school. I went to college and I studied international relations. My initial plan was to have a job where I would fly all over the world. That was really about as far as I had gotten on that. My mom was really into. She had either wanted to be an astronaut or a spy. Watched a lot of spy movies, read a lot of spy novels, did a lot of space. Big fan of space,
Heck
and
yeah,
for whatever reason, I found myself inheriting those proclivities. And I don't know if it was to like. I don't know if that was because I figured, well, she didn't do any of those things because she had me, so I need to like accomplish them in her stead or something like that. But that was, anyway, that was my plan. And then I graduated
sure,
into a recession, and the entire government wasn't hiring for like a year and a half or something like that.
sure,
I had to figure out something else to do. Fast forward through a bunch of really weird jobs. I was a blogger for an equity crowdfunding company, which would have been fine, except that equity crowdfunding wasn't legal yet. I was a rowing coach, so many different places. I was a rowing coach. I edited a quack psychology magazine for a minute, bartended for a minute. Ultimately, I was really interested, it turned out, in finding some kind of job where I felt like I had job security. When
oh
I tell
sure,
people about my early 20s and doing all of these jobs, everybody thinks it sounds so exciting and fun and cool. And the truth is, it does sound exciting and fun and cool
Mhm.
when you are past it and looking back on the situation, because
Right,
the actual
right,
time you're miserable. I was miserable. I didn't really know
hmm
whether I was going to be able to, how I was going to make rent the next month, those kinds of things. It's not fun. And I was jealous of people who had evidently people throwing job offers at them.
right.
I think it was a different time even then than it is now with regard to that. And so I had remembered really enjoying a computer programming class that I had taken in undergrad. And I wasn't able to take many of them because my schedule conflicted. I was on the rowing team, which was a 3-season sport.
Oh
And
sure,
really loved the first class I'd taken. In the second one, I tried to take the second one, and the instructor, I was having a lot of trouble in it, and the instructor informed me at the time that she felt the problem was that I lacked the intellectual firepower for the profession. Yeah, that was
what
the actual wording, which I have never forgotten. Um,
intellectual firepower?
I lacked the intellectual firepower.
Wow,
It was impressive wording. I felt like she had to have thought it up ahead of time or something. There's no way somebody comes up with that on the spot. But
damn.
yeah, so I had quit and found myself sort of wanting to go back to it after I graduated. So a couple years of trying to make ends meet after I graduated college. I went to an immersion program and I did that, and figured I would get some like entry level job or something like that.
Sure.
one of the things that my instructor at the immersion program recommended everyone do was start a blog.
Oh, sure.
And everybody sort of like tries to do this, and they write like 2 or 3 posts and then they fall off the wagon, which is fine. Writing ended up being a really useful way for me to process what I was learning. And that's something that I've continued to do. So I think I'm at 425 posts on chelseatroy.com.
Now,
And
are you going to stop at 1,000? You made an illusion that you would. So
I said at one point that I would retire after 1,000 posts, and I tell people that that is not a joke, and I maintain so far that it is not a joke. Meanwhile, a ways into my career at this point, and I'm still only at 425. So now I'm thinking, like, where do I want to stop? I don't know if I want to set a specific number, because now I write less frequently than I used to, because I'm doing a fair amount of teaching and workshop design and other sort of things. So it's a number that I might need to re-adjudicate down, actually.
Sure. All right.
But we'll see. There's a point at which, or maybe, there's always the possibility that I get there. And this is the truth that I've experienced throughout my career. Like, I have managed to keep the blog. My reason for writing the blog has changed several times while I've been in my career. And I've had different goals. I've worked at Pivotal Labs for a few years, and then I worked at a product company for a few years, and then I did my own thing for a few years, and now I work at Mozilla. I'm on the data team at Mozilla. And so I'm a firm believer that we don't really know where we're going to end up. And so I hold space for the possibility that I get to 1,000 posts and I'm like, no, I'm enjoying this now. I'm going to keep doing this.
Yeah, I
and
finally figured it out.
Maybe it'll happen. But in the meantime, it's sort of fun to have a little progress bar like that I can see even if it doesn't mean anything in the end. Having a fake number is better than having no number at all.
Well, and you could always revise, right? And you could say, oh, I didn't mean 1,000 base 10. You can just say, no, I really meant binary or something, right? I mean, you can just change that at pretty much any moment. And what's somebody going to do about it? Tell you you can't actually, you have to keep going, or you have to stop. I mean, it's yours, right? So
that's been one of the nicest things about the blog is I'm not writing it for anybody else. I'm not hosting it on anybody's thing. It's just a WordPress blog. People reach out. I mean, it's got enough readership at this point that I pretty regularly get emails from folks who are like, will you stick a link to our thing in your blog, or will you let me do a guest post on your blog, or this, that, and the other?
Interesting.
And company or representatives of companies will frequently attempt to pitch it as if it's like a major opportunity for me.
Right.
You are missing out if you do not let me write about SEO strategies for your blog. And it's really nice to be able to be like, or they'll be like, oh, this is, the reason you really need to do this is because we're going to post it to our Twitter account, which has hundreds of thousands of followers. And then you're going to get a lot of visibility. And there's something very liberating about being able to be like, right. Yeah, exactly. And I can email them and be like, visibility is not really why I do this. Thanks, but no thanks.
No thanks.
And,
no thanks.
I like to believe that it allows me to continue writing for like more or less pieces that have some meaning to me, or I think provide value to people. I'm so careful about the word value because I think we overload it, but
but it's what's inspiring you today, what's interesting to you today. And I think that's part of the beauty of it is you can write about what you think is interesting. And if somebody wants to read it, great. And if they want, well, there's plenty of other content out there. Knock yourself out. But
right, exactly.
So Glenn says career evolution changes your path of your communications. Yeah, I'd agree with that. Definitely as you evolve and grow and change, you want or need different things. I completely buy that one, Glenn. And you switched over to a different commenting platform. Thanks, Glenn. Way to keep me on my toes. And hello, Simon. Thank you for joining us. Looking forward to the stream. And he actually has a question for me about Land of Lisp. It's always funny to me when people are actually like reading the things that are behind me. I just kind of forget what I have hiding back there sometimes. One of my friends gave me a lot of grief because I have an awful lot of iPhone boxes sitting behind me. My wife doesn't know why I keep them. I don't know why I keep them. Well, get rid of them. Oh, great. She just said I should get rid of them. The peanut gallery can keep it down in there. or you can comment on the live stream. So yes, I would say that Land of Lisp is worthwhile, and I think learning a language that's completely different than one you use on a regular basis is really good for the brain in all sorts of interesting ways. So I would absolutely recommend Land of Lisp. So, and yes, you're back on Twitch. Thank you, Glenn. So now you one of the other places you and I overlap is you teach in the University of Chicago. I teach in the University of Minnesota. What's that experience been like for you, and how do you think that's sort of changed your approach to software or your thoughts on software, et cetera?
Yeah. I started teaching in 2019. I was working at a product company at the time, and the University of Chicago needed an instructor to teach in their master's program in computer science about iOS development. They had an iOS class. The instructor, on relatively short notice, wasn't going to be able to teach it that quarter. And so they were looking for a replacement. And at the time, I had done iOS projects for Pivotal Labs, but I was not actively working on an iOS project. And I needed to determine whether I would be able to teach that class. And sort of managed to get up to speed and teach it. And after that quarter, I would be allowed to pitch my own classes to the university, which was the real draw for me, because it gave me an opportunity to, having interviewed a lot of master's program students and understood what industry generally expected them to be missing, it felt good to have the opportunity to fill that gap somewhat, because one of the things we were running into over and over at labs was that somebody with a master's in computer science would apply, figuring they were qualified, and not having any idea that there was this whole skill set associated with software engineering that really isn't covered in the academics very much. And it's a thing that I still see. I have a friend who recently got a couple of tattoos based on their logical operator tattoos. And he was showing them off to some of his software engineer friends. This is a young guy, so we'll go easy on him. And somebody asked him what they were, and he was like, "These are the logical operators. The internet is built on this is what the internet is made of. How could you not recognize it?" And we're like, well,
and logical operators.
Right, exactly. But like when we're typing code, we don't use these symbols. We use and or and x, or just the letters. And so there were I felt bad because there were a number of people with plenty of experience in that conversation and this. And I feel like it's an extreme example for illustrative purposes, but I feel like at the time I was running into a lot of that in interviews with folks who had master's degrees. They had been sold the idea that they knew everything they needed to know and then some. And then they were getting into interviews and being very surprised by the challenges that we were asking them to complete. And I was hopeful to be able to help with some of that, and just sort of fell in love with teaching at the time. I think that computer science and programming in general get reputations as being difficult fields. And there's certainly things that are difficult about them, but I think that there's a lot that we can do to mitigate some of the things that are difficult by employing good pedagogy and spending time figuring out how to help folks learn. And that's been something that I've really enjoyed. So I now teach a few different classes at the University of Chicago, and I do a fair amount of professional education stuff too. So I teach workshops through O'Reilly. A lot of them are on managing technical debt or analyzing risk in software systems. I'm working on one for them with, it's about legacy code. So I'm pretty excited about that. I got to go work on the slides for that this evening. I'm very excited. But that one starts next week for O'Reilly folks. And then I'm working on a Thinkific course. I made a Thinkific course about technical debt, which has been it's been interesting. I underestimated how much work something like that requires, which you would think I wouldn't do, because I had already taught like in-person versions of this workshop, synchronous versions of this workshop. But even just the filming, it's a lot. I got very lucky to have like product recommendations from friends who do a lot of this for the video editing and stuff, but it was still a lot of work.
It's funny you mentioned that. I built a new class, not last summer, but the summer before. And my first date giving it was beginning of September sometime. And so I thought, I've got all summer to worry about it. And then I got to July and I realized, that's only 4 weeks away.
Yep.
I better build that course, and then it's just heads down, cranking out stuff, and then you run into those inevitable roadblocks, and yeah,
Oh,
it's
totally.
so much more work than we ever anticipate. It's like a home improvement project, right? It's always going to take twice as long and cost twice as much as you think. And we've got Fuel Snable has finally joined us, so Ugly Snout is with us. So hello, friend, good to have you back. So I like teaching grad students because I feel like there's less of kind of the BS involved, if you want to put it that way.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Although it does depend on the grad student. I've had a few interesting ones where the very first class I ever taught, I realized about, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks into the course that two of my students, and these are all full-time working adults. So even beyond, they're not even just, I'm trying to avoid the real world. These are already in the real world people. They were playing some massive online game. And I don't remember which one, it doesn't matter. And I didn't know how to approach that as a teacher because on the one hand, they weren't being disruptive. It was their money. They turned in their stuff. They engaged when they had to, but they clearly were not engaged in the class. And so it's like, yeah, I can't really give you an A for that one. Sorry. And
right.
So sometimes we get lucky, sometimes we don't.
Was it an in-person class?
Yeah, this was in person, and they sat in the back right next to each other, and I don't know how I figured out they were playing online games the entire time, but they were. And I don't know, this semester I have three they're sort of grad students, but sort of not. They're in a hybrid program where they graduate with a master's and an undergraduate in computer science. And there's a couple of them I kind of look at and I'm like, are you guys like paying attention or not? I can't quite tell, but what are you gonna do? So good afternoon, Coda Sean. Good to have you. So what is alternative to grad student? Yeah, they're like this weird in between. I don't know how to describe them because they're both an undergrad. I think they're technically undergrads right now, but again, they graduate with both degrees somehow. It's a combined program. I didn't even know we had that until this semester, so that was a new one on me. But no,
it's an interesting
general,
one. We have a similar thing at the University of Chicago, a combined program. So far, the program that I teach in has not participated in any of the combined programs. It sounds like they might now. They gave some feedback apparently to the university about the design that they weren't happy with it, and so now they might. But it's I think one of the things about, so I teach Python and intermediate Python, and those classes I think anyone who's at the university could probably take. I also teach mobile software development right now, but mobile software development uses mobile development as a medium to teach a bunch of skills that are really useful for them in like live professional software engineering environments. And it's a class that I have found it is difficult for people who have never had a job to understand the utility of. And I want to be careful about job, because what I mean isn't like, for people who have not been in a professional environment before, it is not clear to them what the value of understanding what kind of feedback to give and when is. Whereas for anybody who's ever been passed over for a senior or manager promotion because the wrong person thought they were too abrasive or whatever, for a person like that, they're like, it really doesn't matter how well I code. If I can't do this, I'm going to hit a ceiling. And what that class does, I hope, is address a lot of the things a lot of the unspoken things that we don't think of as skills, but that very much end up being barriers to people being able to make the impact that they want to make.
Well, I think, to answer Fuel's question, so anybody who's getting a master's degree or up to a PhD would be, at least in my definition, a grad student, Fuel. So to your point, I've always felt that, or long felt that, folks that get into this space get really fixated on technology stuff. It's the shiny toy. We love to play with it, new language, new database, new this, new that. We're always looking for the next new thing. And we often ignore these softer skills. One of the books that's sitting next to me here is, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And that is one of my number one recommendations. I had somebody last fall ask me for 2 recommendations for architecture books. And I said, okay, well, Neil and Mark's Software Architecture, the Hard Parts, and Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I don't even know when that was first published. It's older than I'm guessing you and I combined, honestly. And yet it's still useful and still powerful. Why do so many folks in our space like run away from those kinds of things and just seem so locked into just banging away without realizing that there is a ceiling on that?
Mm-hmm. I think part of it is that the technical skills are the ones that get explicitly acknowledged and rewarded on professional career tracks, and are also the ones that we speak to when we are talking about why such and such company was able to accomplish this or that. I think that we skip over some of the other part, and we have people go to like trainings on soft skills and stuff like that. But the truth is that if the career path evaluation mechanism is treating those skills as elective, then the people whose career path is determined by those evaluation mechanisms will also treat those skills as elective. And I think that also ends up being why, for example, why software maintenance tasks get waylaid, and then we develop these large legacy code bases. One of the really interesting things I've run into in researching legacy code and building a curriculum around helping people deal with legacy code is that everybody has all of these negative associations with legacy code, and yet everybody is dealing with it. And the question I find myself asking is, if we hate this state so much, why/how do we keep doing this to ourselves?
Yes.
Why are we always, right now, the first slide of the first day for this legacy code workshop is, why do we keep ending up here? And I think what happens is that we have all these ideas about things that we do not like, things that are hard for us to deal with when we're working in a code base. But our answers for how to avoid that situation are not realistic to the world that we are working in. Like theoretically, we know, or they're bad models for it. So a good example that I think about a lot is testing. Basically, anytime you ask somebody, anytime I have asked people, oh, how do you avoid this situation? How do you keep the software maintainable, this, that, and the other? Somebody says testing. Testing is it. Testing is how we do it. And I mean, you and I both know, we both worked at Pivotal, testing, very important. I believe that testing is important. I believe that there are certain contexts in which testing is important. I believe that software engineering education and programming education have sold testing at this point as a panacea in a way that it's not a panacea. And so folks end up getting either being very gung-ho on testing and spending a lot of time testing, both in situations where it's useful and in situations where it's wasting their time, or people experience one of those situations where a test doesn't save them. They get jaded on the idea of testing. And then we end up in a situation where folks don't want to do it anymore. And the reason isn't that testing is useful or testing isn't useful. It's that there is a context in which testing is useful. And we don't talk about that context when we talk about when testing is useful. So the context that gets injected there is everywhere. The assumed context is everywhere. And we end up in situations where it's not helpful, or we have not prescribed any other potential solutions for when it doesn't work. And we have a similar situation with a lot of maintenance. Oh, documentation. Okay, well, what do we do when the README gets really large? What do we do when the README gets out of date? We don't have answers for these things because it turns out that using a README is not the appropriate answer for documentation in all contexts. Or we have conversations about interpersonal discussions and how you should always be honest and tell people how you feel, but we don't talk about the particular context in which that's safe or productive. We don't have alternative answers for people. And I think that if I manage to do anything useful in software engineering as a field, it's going to be helping folks start to identify these contexts in which these like best practice advice are useful and think about what the alternatives would be in situations other than that. I think we end up eliding a lot of details under the term best practice, and it ends up making it difficult for us when we are in the situation where the best practice was not designed for, which ends up being a lot more often than we account for when we're learning those practices, in part because we're just not told that there are situations where it doesn't work. Or we're told, oh, it's going to be a rare case where this best practice is not the answer, but we don't talk about what those cases are. And it reminds me of the medical reality in which like any individual rare disease is rare. But when you put together all of the rare diseases, like having some rare disease is like pretty common. And I think we run into the same thing in tech.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. And yeah, there's a lot of things I want to poke at here, and I'm kind of going back through our comments here as people go along. I do want to acknowledge this one from Fuel Snable. How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. Yeah, that's the Contra book, although it might be more interesting in some ways and could be useful if you learn that like successfully, I guess. And then his 8 million lines of COBOL legacy. I think that's fair to say. Now with what you started with around why do we always have legacy code, or why do we live in this environment? It makes me think of the big ball of mud pattern. It is probably the most common architectural pattern we have. It's one of the most reviled patterns we have, and yet also one of the most common ones we have. And I've jokingly asked, do we set out to create one? I mean, as an architect, I've never sat down and said, oh, big ball of mud, here we go, everybody. And yet that's where we end up. And I'm not entirely sure how to feel about that. I don't know. Let's poke at that. And then I want to circle back to context and testing. We got some very good comments around that too, but why do we end up in a big ball of mud? Is it just inevitable? Does all software devolve to that, or do we just need to be more diligent?
It's a great question. And I think that there are answers. The answers bridge the gap between the technical and the socio-technical to some degree. I think that there are a whole bunch of contributing factors. I think one contributing factor that we mischaracterize a lot is the skill of the engineers involved. I think there's a tendency. So I ask people when I do my workshops on tech debt, what does tech debt mean to you? What is it? And people will give all kinds of different answers. The point that I'm usually making when I ask this question is that everybody has a sinking feeling associated with tech debt, but folks' answers about what precisely it is will differ pretty widely. And that's even within engineers. I mostly teach engineers.
Yeah.
When you also add product managers and designers to the conversation, now we've got potentially wildly different definitions. But because we're all using the same words, we think we're all talking about the same thing. And it makes entire classes of discussion useless, including the one where we're talking about how we need to pay down tech debt in the code base. Turns out the people that we're talking to, that doesn't mean the same thing that it means to us. But I think one of the ways that we mischaracterize tech debt is we construe it as bad code written by bad developers, such that if just a good developer such as ourselves were to rewrite it, then we wouldn't have this problem anymore. And first of all, the amount of hubris associated with that set of assumptions is ... a choice. But also there's this piece of it that when we assume that the reason it's bad code is it was written by bad developers who didn't know what they were doing, that allows us to skip asking any questions about the context in which the developers had to write code like this. Because frequently the problem isn't that it was bad developers. It was a capable developer who knew better, who was put under a constraint where they didn't have a choice. And when we don't ask questions about those constraints, what happens is we start heading full speed towards our better solution. And so we're moving at full speed when we hit the constraint ourselves. And now we've wasted, potentially, in the worst case scenario, wasted a bunch of time and maybe even messed up a bunch of stuff purely because we didn't understand that the reason that this thing wasn't the way that we wanted it to be in the first place was because of a constraint that we did not even realize we were going to face. I've seen this play out so many times, and it's a really demoralizing experience for the developers as well. If they're lucky, it's something that they can either change or they can salvage in some other way that's still better than maybe the original solution was. But it puts us in a situation where, like, when we're failing to ask those questions, then we end up back where we started a lot of times with less time. So I think that is a part of it, is that we mischaracterize what makes code harder to maintain in ways that make it hard for us to do things that will actually avoid making that code harder to maintain. It certainly doesn't help that the vast majority of engineering education is how to build X from scratch. Which means we spend very little time. My students do a lot of reading code, a lot of maintaining code, a lot of analyzing code. They do relatively little building something of their own from scratch. What I'm trying to do is mimic what they're spending time on as engineers in a professional environment. It has been a rare and exciting occasion for me when I've been able to build something from scratch And 6 weeks in, I was no longer building a thing from scratch anymore. Inevitably, I was contacting another developer. I was working on something like that. And I think it doesn't help our situation that the exact skills that are required to be able to prevent a code base from turning into a big ball of mud are skills that we largely ignore in the process of educating. And so even if we were to value them on employee evaluations, which by the way, we often don't, but even if we were to do that, people don't know how to do those things. And debugging, we have very few people have an idea sort of like how to do debugging, but we don't offer a lot of concrete systems for folks to use in order to help them debug. We don't provide.
Just put in a breakpoint.
Yeah, it's right, exactly. And people end up in this cycle towards the end where they're banging their head against the wall, trying the same thing over and over, and it's not working. So I think there's a piece of it where we don't value or teach the skills associated with maintenance, such that even if we were given the time and the resources to make a thing maintainable, we're often not really thinking about how. And I think there are a bunch of different sort of misconceptions in the way that we approach work that contribute to that. I think a lot of the reason that legacy code ends up legacy code is from lost context. Somebody once knew something about the code base that nobody knows anymore. And the way that we would have avoided that is through context transfer activities. How do you transfer context? You can do it through meetings, which developers revile and say are useless. You can do it through pull request review, which developers largely phone in. We can do it through pair programming, which a lot of developers
looks good to me.
Right, exactly. There's a lot of that. I have very rarely seen somebody open a pull request. I've very rarely seen somebody open a pull request and have a description there that helps them at all figure out how they're supposed to review it. So it's not purely on the reviewer. But then I've seen a lot of reviews that are more or less, it looks good to me, or it's, here are my personal beefs with the syntactic choices that you made. It's very little, what was the actual goal here? And there's almost no attempting to replicate the acceptance criteria as a developer in a way that would mean that if the original submitter were no longer able to work on this, the reviewer would then be capable of taking over the work. Bar for pull request review is so absurdly, it's so high that it sounds absurd to folks who are used to this. And I think part of the reason that we think that code review is so much more streamlined than pair programming, and we can't imagine taking the amount of time that pair programming would take, is that pair programming fundamentally sets a much higher standard for the amount of context transfer that has to occur. Whereas with code review, the sort of rubber stamp thing is an option. And the reason it's so much more streamlined is there's this whole piece of context transfer that it ignores, and it doesn't bite us until somebody leaves. And we end up in a situation where we don't have this. We have this entire sort of productivity culture that argues against doing a lot of the things that would make code more maintainable over time.
Right. Yeah, take the time it takes so it takes less time is one of the things I say to my teenager a lot. And it's hard to justify that sometimes because, one of the more depressing things that I experienced, I had this young developer come up to me, I don't know, this is probably almost a decade ago now, and he was bemoaning the fact that in his last one-on-one, he got chastised by his manager because he wasn't closing tickets fast enough. And he said to me, Nate, I'm trying to do it right. I get the bug and I put in some tests and I clean the code up. And so, it takes me a couple days, but this other guy, the senior guy, he's closing things in a couple hours, but the code's worse than when he found it. And he introduced 3 new bugs as part of that. But the manager loves him because he's closing things right away because that's all the manager's focused on, not on the long-term effect on the code base, the total cost of ownership. And I do think that's part of that problem there is we don't evaluate it properly. We get so fixated on, that time to completion instead of worrying about, well, what's the bigger picture here? Is the code better than when we found it? Is the test suite better? Have we introduced any regressions, et cetera, et cetera? And if that's not valued by the management, I can understand. And this guy ended up just leaving. He's like, I'm out. And he went to a different company because he got so frustrated with that culture. And I don't have a good answer for that other than change your culture or change your culture. Right.
I think we offer a very myopic set of evaluation criteria as the default, and it makes it very difficult. And I think we're faced with 2 choices. Like we have all of these norms in tech that work against us being able to do things in a maintainable way. And as I see it, there are two solutions. One of them I think is mitigative, but potentially useful still. And the other one would be to resolve the situation by changing our culture, which is going to take a long time.
Right.
One of the things that I'm hoping to focus on in some of the upcoming materials is these two different paths. One of them being changing our culture and how we would go about doing that. Which the issue that I have with content like that is that it is almost unitarily useful to people who have already accumulated some semblance of power. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who reach out and say that my blog posts have really moved them are not themselves in positions yet to be able to use a lot of that knowledge. And I would love to be able to find ways for those folks to have an easier time under the current system until we are able to change the system to something that is more sustainable. But the other thing that I think about a lot is whether we would have an easier time with some of this if we started recognizing the context in which certain things are useful, and if we were able to recognize that some of these things that we treat as panaceas are not in fact panaceas, and understand, all right, if we're trying to reduce risk in our code base, and what situations is testing going to be useful? In what situations is testing not going to be useful? And what can we do to address the risks in those areas where testing is not going to address them, or something like that?
Right.
Or with documentation, saying like, all right, objectively, we're telling people documentation is good, and that's fine to say that documentation is good. But the truth is, very few software engineers have the skill to write an engaging 6,000 word README. Nobody wants to maintain a 6,000 word README. And because the 6,000 word READMEs are unmaintained, nobody wants to read a 6,000 word README when they roll onto the project. And so we say that documentation is good, but we don't back that up with effective strategies for folks to be able to document things in a way that's going to be maintainable in the long term. So I would love to help folks develop the sort of skills that, and maybe those things are mitigative. Maybe it's true that what I'm saying is documentation takes too much time away from delivering features, and because people are placed under deadlines, they therefore just don't document. Maybe what I'm suggesting is harm reduction, to be like, here are 6 ways that you can provide better documentation than nothing in way less time than having to trawl through a 6,000 word README. But I think that even that step can be really useful, because we have gotten in our own way so much with taking context-specific solutions and selling them to the broader tech community as universal solutions. I think we've done a lot of that. I think part of it is there's sort of this tech culture of we think of ourselves as intellectuals. We like to treat things as intellectual exercises. And so we're like, documentation is good. Therefore, taking that to its logical extreme, what I should do is document everything in this one place, and that's going to be having drying things up is good. Taken to its logical extreme, what that means is I should only have one place where I'm recording everything that happens. And I think that some of these logical extremes don't mix particularly well with the realities of maintaining, particularly a project over the long term and on a team where not everybody has the same information about what's going on.
Right. Yeah, so I clearly struck a nerve with Glenn, who's pulled aside by a manager for not having the right throughput because he wrote tests. And then a month later, when all the bug reports came in, the manager apologized because it turns out he actually had the highest throughput, because guess what? He didn't have to rework a bunch of things.
Oh my gosh.
And then Simon talks about docs using like things like Spring REST docs. And then I agree, Glenn, is there a way to test our docs, or like, don't forget to test them as well? I think that's underrated. Now, I know you're being funny, Sean, and I'll take that for what it's worth. But yes, what is documentation? I think the contextual bit is really important. This is something that Simon chimed in on, a while back when it first came up, because we have this tendency in technology to make everything an absolute, and you talked about best practices. And I think it's Neil who likes to say that today's best practice is tomorrow's anti-pattern. And there's certainly something in that, but we do tend to be so absolutist about some of these things instead of understanding more of the nuance. And that really struck home to me. I had a friend of mine who has sadly since passed away, but he was consulting with this group and no tests at all. So his first reaction was, we need to write tests. And then he took a step back and said, well, hang on a sec. How long have you all been on the code base? And the person with the least amount of experience had been there for 10 years. And so it's like, oh, okay, well, we're going to write tests, but that might not be step one. For that particular group, that might be step 3 or 4. And I think that's part of not just having I just follow this rote recipe every single time without interjecting any thought into it. You've got to look at the context and understand the nuance behind it. Tests are great as long as they're helping you with what you need them to do. A friend of mine told me he was on one project where, they brought him in because there were a bunch of regressions. And so he's getting the thing set up and he's looking at the tests and he was amazed there was tests, right? And so the tech lead was like, oh yeah, we've got like 92% code coverage. Like, oh, that's great. And you're still having lots of regressions. And then he starts digging into the tests and he realizes that none of the tests have any asserts. And so he goes back to the tech lead and he's like, listen, none of your tests have asserts. And the tech lead's like, yeah, but we got 92% code coverage. It's like,
wow.
Okay. I mean,
that's like a malicious compliance level.
Yeah.
It feels like somebody was told you have to get 90% code coverage or I'm firing all of you. And they were like, right. We have 2 weeks. How do we, and this is what accomplishes it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Fuel says there's one single way to write software. That's my way. Exactly. And then Glenn says, no, I'm pretty sure it was my way. So yeah, no, I think there's something to be said for that. So, okay, good. I'm glad you were joking, Sean. I assume that was sarcasm. We need like a sarcasm tag or something to make sure that comes clear. But yeah, I think it's fascinating to me that, we've touched on this a few times already today. There's this huge gap between how we teach this and then what you really need to know in order to be successful in the real world. And you hit upon this with your students where, I hardly ever have them write anything from scratch because we never get to do that. And I think back to everything I did in computer science in my undergraduate, and it's all, okay, write this program that, sorts a list. And it's like, I've never written bubble sort. I'm never going to write that, and yet everything we did was small, short, ended. Maybe you did something that was a semester long and it was all from scratch.
That's right.
And then you get in the real world, nothing is small, nothing lasts 3 months. And I think part of that's just, it's hard to teach that, especially if you've never lived in that environment. And for better or worse, a lot of our PhDs don't have that real world experience. But, it makes me wonder, like, why do we still have this massive gap? And what can folks like us do to maybe close that?
It is a great question. I think part of I can't entirely blame academia for that because I find that we in industry still encourage that to some degree. So I had somebody reach out to me. I think it's been long enough at this point that the statute of limitations on this has expired. Somebody reached out to me, and this has happened to me before. This happened to me with Netflix, and it's also happened to me with Twitter, where some director reaches out and they're like, oh my God, I've read half your blog and I need you so bad because we're working on this thing. We're working on this project. And we absolutely need somebody who's thinking about this the way that you're thinking about it and thinking about maintainability, changing our giant Byzantine system. And usually there's like postscript. It would be great if somebody of a marginalized identity applied to this position. I'm like, I don't know if they just went out and like trawled I don't know what they did. Maybe they're just out there and they're like, all right, I want you to email every dyke who's ever written on software or something. But anyway, it's happened enough times that I'll then ask the director some questions. I'll be like, why do you want me specifically? Like, what actually have I said? Sometimes they do have very good answers. And so I have to give credit to both the Twitter and the Netflix directors. They had answers to these questions. Plenty of people don't.
Sure.
But so then I start the interview process. And literally the first thing that I have to do is, I'll use Twitter as an example. The first thing that I need to do is they put me in like a Zoom and a coder pad. And there are two like guys silently with their arms folded like this. They're watching me. And what they would like me to do is Dijkstra's from scratch. And I have 40 minutes. And I'm not in a position here to interrogate whether this is testing the skill that they're actually supposed to be interviewing me for, or not supposed to be interviewing me for, but like theoretically the reason that somebody who gets paid a lot of money has spent several hours getting paid a lot of money to listen to me cuss on the internet and read what I had to say about this. And that's the reason that we're having this meeting today, is because that person spent that time and that amount of the company's money. And what they want to know is, can I do Dijkstra's from scratch in 40 minutes? Now, part of this is like, there's a piece of it that feels very, and it's not that I don't think there's value in understanding how to implement Dijkstra's. Sure, there are a lot of really valuable concepts in a discussion about how to implement something like Dijkstra's shortest path algorithm. However, there is a piece of that interview that feels like a very unthought out. The first thing we need to check is, did you bend the knee? Did you go back and prepare for this interview by researching things that we know you're not doing in your day job? Did you spend time getting paid by your current employer to prepare to have this conversation with us? Because if you didn't, we're not interested. And I don't do that. I don't do that. I don't feel that it's fair to my current employer. And it's not, I don't think it is good that we prepare people in the way that we prepare people that misses a lot of these important skills. However, I understand it from the perspective of the fact that a lot of these programs are getting evaluated on how many people they get into FANG and FANG-esque companies. And the thing that those companies want to know is, can you do this short, very well circumscribed problem that has an ending? And the truth is, even when those companies prescribe that problem, it's going to be one of maybe 80 problems that we prescribe like that. And so it creates a test to teach to in a way that's, when you have something of such limited scope like that, all we need to do is make sure all of our students can solve these 80 well circumscribed problems, and we are guaranteed to score highly on the metric we're evaluated on, which is admission into these places. It's very it reeks of the same sort of like arbitrariness that getting into the top whatever schools in the first place does, but it's a system that is well understood within academia, and people understand how to teach to that. And I think that's sort of why it happens.
Right. Yeah, I had one of my grad students, I think this was last year, I don't remember which FANG it was, but he kind of talked to me about the process he went through there, and he got all the way, I think they offered him a job, if I remember right. And the only thing I could speak to as to the efficacy of that is it's a forcing function, because I have to imagine some of these organizations are getting thousands and thousands and thousands of resumes, and it's an easy sieve. And it's sort of like, well, listen, if you're not willing to spend a couple of months, basically going up and memorizing some algorithms from computer science, 150 or something, then, we're not even interested in talking to you. Now, I don't think that's a particularly effective way to hire, because I'm guessing they're missing out on an awful lot of very, very good candidates as part of that. But I mean, I think it speaks to just how challenging it can be to hire in the first place. How do you evaluate somebody in a half an hour, even a couple hours? I've thought about this in terms of like professional sports. You look at the NFL, they have essentially unlimited resources to scout athletes anywhere in the world. And you take someone like Tom Brady, love him or hate him, probably going to go down as one of the all-time greats to ever play the sport. And yet every single team in the NFL passed on him, not once, not twice, but 5 times. And several passed on him 6 times until he finally gets selected in the 6th round. How do you measure what he's going to become in something that is as measurable as athletics, where we have tape? How fast can you run? How much can you lift? How far can you jump? And then you get to our space and it's like, well, how many words a minute can you type? Well, no, that's not very useful.
We don't really have anything. And moreover, we're not, like, when a company rejects a candidate, there is, I don't know, I won't say there isn't, because I don't know. I do not know of any place that takes an interest in where rejected candidates ended up and what they did there. The only false negative story I'm aware of that's well known is the guy who got rejected from Facebook and then founded WhatsApp that got bought by Facebook for $19 billion.
I think that worked out pretty well.
I love that story is because, I mean, there are a million stories like that. There have got to be. And maybe they're not all that scale, right? That one overcomes a lot of visibility barriers. But we have no, our metrics for the way that this works would never reflect if our process is missing, is passing on a candidate that we should be interested in keeping. And And I think that's hard. And I know that it would be extremely effort intensive to keep up with that kind of thing.
Right, right. I mean, I'm always interested in trying to figure out how you learn, because that's when I think about this space, there's always something new. And what we're going to be doing in a year or two is probably different than what we're doing today. And so I'm always trying to pick at, okay, so you know Python. You weren't born knowing Python. How did you teach yourself Python? When a new version comes out or a new library comes out, how do you learn it? What's your process? Because that to me is more interesting, and trying to sort of pick at how you think about some of these problems is more illustrative to me anyways. Can you be successful in this? And it's hard. There's no getting around it. I mean, I don't have any magic answers to how to do hiring better, but I'm not a big fan of the, as to your approach, show that you've bent the knee and you've put yourself through the rigor of memorizing a bunch of stuff. And then we can sit here and, look at you and scowl and be like, well, we all had to do this, so you have to do this too. Like, okay, fine. Let's see. Where'd it go here? There's the one I was looking for. So Glenn made an interesting point. Can we pair our graduate students with open source projects to build their coding skills and architecture skills? That's a good idea, Glenn. We should try to figure out how to do that, man. I like that. So, well, Fuel, you might be in a unique situation that you're going to continue to do ERP integrations into the future. Hopefully you'll get a chance to break out of 8 million lines of legacy code. But so one of the things I wanted to touch on is this word legacy. We all use it. We all throw it around. It's almost always a negative. Nobody wants to work on a legacy code base. And I've tried to recast that in my brain around more like heritage to try to put a bit of a better spin on it. Because in fairness, if you've got an application that's been delivering business value for like a decade, you should be like, hey, good job, everybody. It's still a product we're investing in.
Right.
Good job. So, I mean, do you think we need to like reframe it a bit? Sometimes we get so pejorative and it's like, is it really a bad thing?
Yeah, I think so. I think that software applications either die heroes or live long enough to see themselves become the villains.
Well played.
And I think the reason for that is that we aren't thinking about what it means for a system to become legacy, which is effectively it has remained useful for long enough that we have been sending poor SOBs in here for 10 or 20 years because it is still the best way to get the thing that we need, until finally we declare maintenance bankruptcy and rewrite the entire thing from scratch, which whoever is doing it loves doing, because we can all be geniuses in our own mind until the system hits the reality of being maintained by multiple people across a larger time domain. But I think a lot of it is that we're all used to sort of this individual siloed working idea, and we're sold this idea of like one individual genius being able to create things. And so being able to create things collaboratively over larger time domains, it's not there, and it's a thing that we're not valuing, such that when we do manage it, even though what we've managed is sort of like a satisfying job of it, we've created a legacy system. It has its problems, but it's survived a long time. We don't have a lot of appreciation for why it might have survived a long time, what's useful about it. And I think that it would be really helpful for folks for us to find a way to think about that makes it clear, sort of, what's valuable about this space. It's interesting to do. So I've written, while I was writing code independently, I was writing a fair amount of it for the Zooniverse. They were calling it a citizen science platform at the time. I think now we've moved towards a volunteer science platform. But they do a fair amount of collaborations with either NASA or projects that are aided by NASA. And so it's very interesting to see the difference in the way that space technologists and space historians talk about old systems relative to the way that we do as software engineers. Because in professional code jobs, a lot of times people are like, it's an old system, it's terrible. And it's like, you're supposed to know at old what the person thinks of the system. Whereas people will walk into like the vehicle assembly building at NASA and they'll be like, oh my gosh. And believe me, it is a godforsaken building in a lot of ways. You walk in there, like, we're not talking about, I mean, it's absolutely huge, but we're not talking about some palatial structure here. This is, it is old. It is a building that is old, but the reaction to that among sort of like space technologists isn't, oh, it's old, it's trash. It's like, oh,
Right.
we went to the moon because we were able to do something in this. Like I am standing where X person and Y person and Z person stood, the greatest, arguably, engineers of their generation, the engineers that inform everything we do in our generation. And to them, that's a big deal. They revere it, they value it, they care about it. We don't think about things that way largely. And I wonder if it's because there's a difference between the public image of the space program versus the way that we think about, like, you know, some product company, some insurance company that's been around for 30 years or whatever. Although, because the truth is, like, I hate to inform folks of this, but like the foundations of NASA are not particularly savory either. We got a Nazi sympathizer to be the first director of NASA. It's always been a very, very weird place to engage with for people of marginalized identities because there was a lot of Nazi sympathy in the foundation of the American space program. But there's this sort of understanding of it. Maybe it's a Star Trekified, Star Warsified, like seek out new life and new civilizations, boldly go where no one has gone before, sort of image associated with it that creates a sort of halo effect around some of the older stuff. And we don't have that in commercial and enterprise applications, maybe. Maybe that's it. I'm speculating at this point.
Yeah.
But there is something to be recognized in a system that has stood the test of time, and its problems, I think, need to be weighed against the reason we're facing those problems rather than scrapping the system and starting over.
Sure. Well, I wonder if part of that too is just the physical versus metaphysical aspect of it, right? So you think about infrastructure in Chicago or the Twin Cities where you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. We should rip it down and start over. But you can't, you know, and I remember this guy I was playing golf with a bunch of years ago was complaining about, you know, it took him 10 years to redo the Golden Gate Bridge. It only took him 4 years to build it, you know, and he was trying to make some comment about how, you know, the kids these days. And I just looked at him and I said, how many cars were going over the Golden Gate Bridge when they built it? How many people lived on the other side?
Right.
You know, and that's the part that we, you know, instinctively, like, oh, if we're going to replace this bridge, that can't happen in 6 weeks.
Right.
You just can't do it. It takes time. And then we look at software, and because it doesn't have that physicalness to it, people are like, well, how hard could it be? It's just some words. Just go edit the words.
Right.
There's so much more to it, you know, and part of what you've been kind of getting at, or we've been chewing around the edges of, we don't have that context as to why did the developer do this? There was probably a really good reason. There was that bug that only happens when month end also corresponds with a bank holiday. And we didn't think of that when we wrote the requirements. And so we had to hack this in. And by the way, we had to do it right the flip now, because if the system is down, we're losing millions of dollars. Yeah, you know, the VP standing over my shoulder, you know, they got no patience. They need it done right now. Oh, let me slap it in and get it out there. Okay, good. That problem's fixed. Now I want to go back in and clean up. No, we don't have time for that. You know, so I think that's what gets lost is we're dealing with patches on top of patches on top of patches, and people expect that you can just change it because it's just words. A little more to it than that.
There is. There's a lot more to it than
that. Yeah, it's. I do think that's one of those fundamental challenges. And I know Rich Hickey's got this great quote about, you know, most of the problems in software are problems of misconception. You know, that we're always in such a hurry. We don't really take the time to step back and ask, like, what are we really trying to do here? You know, what is the ask? It's just go, 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 go. And you know, my wife's a business analyst, and I've seen this from her perspective a bunch, where they're like, well, we got the development team, so they're going to start coding. But we don't have any requirements yet. Well, yeah, but the team's ready, so they're just going to start working. On what?
What are they going to start working on?
Would that ever happen in the physical world? Would you ever have a construction crew? All right, guys, just start building. We don't know what we're supposed to build. Well, you know, but we got the guys, so, you know, just start pouring some concrete.
Oh, man.
You'd never do that. It's absurd. And yet we do it every day of the week. So I think some of that's the immaturity of this industry, that we haven't been around that long, and we haven't fully confronted the fact that there are consequences to, you know, editing the words, and it isn't just that. There's so much more to it, and again, all that missing context and, why did the person do this? Why did they choose that? And you're right. We're always so dismissive of, well, the person before. Like, I think every developer's had that experience where you're reading some code and you're like, oh man, the person who wrote this is a total idiot. And then you realize it was you.
Right.
It just was a couple years ago. That's always humbling.
The angrier you are about the code, the more likely it is that when you do get blamed, it turns out it's your fault.
Yeah. I did that. Oops. Good times. I hope we can solve that. I really do.
Code bases, if you do the get blame and it turns out the line you're about to edit was last edited by like Steve Wozniak or something like that.
That'd be great. Like, oh, that's someone who's really good, really smart, maybe, we think. Yeah. Oops.
Right. Like, oh, maybe I can be careful.
Right. No, 100%. Oh, I love that. Oh, let's see. What else? Well, the other thing, I mean, not to completely throw tech aside, but a couple of the things I was curious about as I was poking around putting together my bio for you today. Tell me more about Gigi. I'm very excited about the fact that to my right is my fancy little road bike, and so I'm very excited to hear about your bike.
Yes, I have an e-bike. Her name is Gigi. She is a Civi Cheetah, Civi, and then a Cheetah. She has a black frame, and the fuselage and stuff is basically coffee colored. I love her. Class 3. And so she can go 28 miles an hour, which is wonderful because on the city streets of Chicago, that's like about as fast as you need to go. So my biggest fear, honestly, is always figuring out. I'm afraid to like lock her up outside of a cafe or something and then go inside for several hours. I have not figured out exactly how that's going to work yet. But during the pandemic, she was a lifesaver because when we weren't really able to take transit safely and while we weren't really able to take cars safely or anything like that, as long as it was warm enough, I could go places on my bike. And so I really enjoyed that about it. I recently moved to a house and am trying to figure out how to make her as easily accessible as possible because I'm sure, as you know, the thing about e-bikes is that you have to keep the battery at a certain temperature. And that is a temperature that winter in Chicago frequently falls outside. So I can't just leave her in the garage. So I have to figure out what to do. But yeah.
Well, and bikes always strike me as an N-1 problem, where however many bikes you have, you probably need one more.
You need another one. That's
true. Yeah. At least that's what I tell my wife. She's not buying that one. So although I realize that you also have to stay below the S-1 number. So there's a number at which point your spouse will no longer be your spouse if you exceed it.
Yeah.
And so there is a number at which I go, okay, yeah, if I get this many bikes or this many, golf clubs or whatever, it's like, yeah, that's going to be a problem. All right, it's going to stay between those two numbers and I'll probably be okay. So
I hear that happens with pets too sometimes.
Yeah, or kids. I'm of the opinion that you shouldn't have more kids than you have laps, just because then you're playing zone all the time, and that's tough. I've got a friend who's got like 4 kids, and I don't know how they do it. I mean, I know how hard it is keeping track of one teenager. I can't imagine what you do if you've got 4 of them running around. They've all got activities, and kayaks too. Yeah, exactly, Glenn. Kayaks, same problem. A lot of things fall into the N-1 problem, my friend. There's no getting around that. So, Norway also has problems with batteries and low temp. Totally. Well, Glenn, bless your heart, Glenn, to say the least. But no, I'm with you. I absolutely adore, the bikes. I think it's one of the best ways to get around. And I've never understood the people who run long distances and they're like, oh yeah, man, endorphins. Like, no, riding the bike. Yeah, that makes way more sense.
I definitely get endorphins from riding a bike.
Totally. There's good riding in the Midwest. People kind of lose sight of that. I was thinking about that this morning too, that, this is a very overlooked, underrated sort of tech area, between the Twin Cities, Chicago, Madison, Milwaukee. I mean, there's a lot of tech that goes on around here. And I think people look past it because, January. Well,
people look past it. They think of it as such it's interesting that people sort of negate the entire area for outdoor activities. I mean, I certainly do it too. I was in Hawaii semi-recently for a work event, and I decided I would learn to surf while I was out there, and was talking to the surf instructor, and he's from Chicago, grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and he was like, oh no, yeah, there's definitely surfing in Chicago. I could not even believe it. And
Sure.
so I looked up. Sure enough, they're surfing in the fall and winter in Chicago. People just wear wetsuits. So I was looking
Yeah.
around for recommendations for that kind of thing. And it turns out there's an entire cold water surfing community in Norway. They
Yeah.
surf in Norway. And
Uh-huh.
I
Uh-huh.
don't know if it's that Norway, maybe we got some Norwegians in the chat or something, and you can help me
We
understand
got one.
the degree of outdoorsiness in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
apparently everybody there is just a very, very woodsy, and they like to go outside. And I just cannot even imagine, because it's gotta be colder there than it is
Cold.
here, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. Well, there's a lot less sun. That's the other thing. Until you get to the springtime and the summertime. I was in Finland, in Helsinki, earlier this year, and oh boy, I couldn't handle that in December because I was there in February and it was still not a lot of daylight, and I just couldn't even imagine. So yeah, Fuel says that Norwegians like their outdoors. And yeah, Finns, yeah, they definitely take it to a whole nother level. And my
Really?
understanding is the Swedes sort of derisively refer to Finns as the forest people or something to that effect. That you can, how do they phrase it? You can take the Finn out of the forest, but you can't take the forest out of the Finn or something to that effect. So, well, Sweden, Norway. I mean, is there a difference, Fuel? I jest. I jest. No, I think a lot of that just comes down to attitude, though, right? And just sort of this expectation that it's always cold, and it's not. I mean, summers are beautiful, fall's beautiful, spring can be a mixture, but
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know why that is. I had a friend of mine when his daughter got married. A bunch of folks came into town for the wedding festivities, and they did a bunch of bike stuff, and they were just like, "Oh my God, it's like so beautiful here." Yeah. Yeah, there's a reason millions of people live in this part of the world. It isn't
Right.
just because, well, we were born here and didn't know we could leave.
Right. Exactly.
Man.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
There is
the
a
other
part of me
thing,
that like hopes the coast don't figure it out, though.
right,
Like, people will be
right.
like, I mean, I feel a little bit lucky sometimes, and this is absolutely terrible, but I mean, it sort of reaches a comical level in the political discussion about like, oh, Chicago is terrible and this, that, and the other. And on the one hand, it's awful and it's not true. And on the other
Hmm.
hand, there's a part of me that's like, yeah, stay over there so that I can keep my reasonable rent and
Uh-huh.
endless theater options.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
Right?
no, that's a great point. Like, just no, let's not. Yeah, you go ahead. You keep having that attitude. That's fantastic. But I had
Mhm.
someone also remind me the beauty of winter is it means that certain bugs can only grow so large before they
That's true.
die.
That is
And if
true.
you've been to the South, that Glenn, I know
I
you've
do.
almost been eaten by some of those. So it's
Yeah.
there's a reason why you like to have a hard freeze occasionally. But
It's true. I'm from Louisiana originally, and we've got some critters down there.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, they'll eat you. They'll eat you right up, and they won't think twice about it. So, oh yeah, yeah, mosquitoes are the state bird of Georgia. I think they're the state bird of Minnesota too, to be honest with you. So maybe that does translate beyond different places. There aren't large, but there's a lot of them. Yeah, that's true. There's definitely a lot of them for sure. For sure, I'm with you on that, Fuel. But let's see. Oh, and not. I'm not sure what the English word for. No, okay, my Swedish and Norwegian is so bad. I have no idea how to translate that. I'm sure Google can tell us, Fuel, but that would require me to go to a different tab. So one other thing I want to poke on, because I've just finished watching season 1 of Ted Lasso for the fourth time. Is there
Yeah,
anything during the pandemic that you logged onto from a streaming or reading or listening perspective? You're like, oh, thank God.
I did. Well, so some of them are good, some of them weren't. I had my pod, and I very early on sort of had a pod. I was living in a multi-story building at the time. I was on the second floor. A friend of mine who had referred me to the building from my gym lived on the ninth floor. And every Friday night, I would go over there and I would watch movies with him. And so
Nice.
we started referring to it as pod night. It gave me something to do while there were like limited things to do. And
Mm-hmm.
I found the pandemic. I mean, we were all horrified at the time, so there wasn't really an opportunity to take lessons from what we were experiencing. But it was interesting to see, like, when your schedule is cleared, what do you
Mm,
do with the time?
yeah.
Um, and my aunt, to this day, sort of lament. She was like, I would finish work and then I could just like go out for ice cream with my friends and walk around on the sidewalk. And it reminded her of simpler times from when she was a kid, like growing up in New York. She didn't have all these responsibilities and stuff. And, but for me, yeah, it was that pod night. And we watched a whole bunch of things start to finish at this point. We still do it every Friday night. We meet and we watch movies, usually a TV show episode or something like that. Most recently, we recently did watch Everything Everywhere All at Once. And they have introduced me to a show where the guy from Nathan For You helps people rehearse difficult conversations beforehand or something like that. It's weird, but we have watched the entirety of Community, which I hadn't seen. Yeah. We watched the entirety of Ted Lasso.
Yes.
We watched, what else have I watched? I wasn't much of a TV person really before the pandemic, but lately I've seen a lot of seasons of Ink Master. That was mostly my pick, and I'm not saying necessarily was a great pick, but it's good. I watched Lucifer, the Netflix show. Okay. I watched that a lot of times, actually, because I watched it the first time actually watching TV. And then after that, I found it to be a familiar and comforting thing to put on in the background while I was working out alone in my studio apartment. So I've watched that more times than I am proud of. And right now I'm working on, I just recently finished Our Flag Means Death, or What There Is of Our Flag Means Death.
Okay.
So yeah, it's, I try to stick to things with a bit of a comedic bent lately. Yeah. I just had a really hard time with horror, honestly, ever since 2016 and the presidential election, which is not to say that nothing terrible was happening before that, but that was where I started hitting the horror threshold.
Yeah, there's only so much drama you can take before it's like, I need an escape from all that. So, yeah, totally agree. I have found Ted Lasso to be just almost perfect television, and cannot wait for the next season, even though I realize it's probably going to be our last. And it is probably going to be our last,
but we can appreciate it for what it is. I try to do. One of the things that I've been working on personally lately is trying not to lament what things aren't and just appreciate what they are.
Yeah.
And television shows are a good spot to do that. I am shocked at how much stock I put in television shows being a thing that they aren't and weren't and were not meant to be. I did that first with Lucifer, where I was like, all right, well, the queer representation in this is terrible. But the truth is, it started as like a television show during an era when television networks were under a lot of pressure to not show queer imagery at all. And so
sure.
I can lament that. And I can also be like, all right, well, this is the context in which this thing is written. So.
I think it was really interesting, that comment you made about what happens when essentially your calendar gets cleared and what would you choose to do. And, I hear all these laments over the last year or so as people are like, nobody wants to work anymore. And and all these kind of statements that make my blood boil a bit. And I feel like so many people use that couple of years as like a chance to reset a bit and to take a step back and ask themselves, like, what's really important to me? How do I want to spend my time? And maybe it isn't 60, 70, 80 hours at a job that I don't love or that I know doesn't really love me. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think that's actually fairly healthy in the grand scheme of things. And as inconvenient as that may be for some organizations. But I think that's a very astute way of looking at it, that it was an opportunity to reset and reevaluate. But,
yeah, I would agree.
So the last thing I want to touch on is coffee, because I know the other thing that stood out to me as I was scanning through making a bio for you today. Vanilla lattes. Why vanilla?
I don't know. I think it was just the first syrup that I tried that I liked. I've had others recently. Somebody got me a lavender latte, and that was delicious.
Oh.
Yeah. I very much appreciated that. I like lavender. I had a honey latte in Manhattan once that I really liked.
Yeah.
Some of them I do think. So I think that sometimes coffee shops go a little hog wild with the syrups, and they'll be like, this is a maple caramel, honey, brown sugar, cinnamon latte. And then I try it and I'm like, so this is liquid candy.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I do expect it to fundamentally taste like coffee, but with like
Right.
a little bit of a flavor of something else. Vanilla
Right.
accomplishes that, honey accomplishes that, lavender accomplishes that. But
Mhm.
anytime they're like, "This is our Christmas special," I'm like, I'll pass. It's just a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
not trying to drink a Reese's peanut butter cup here. I want coffee, but a little bit of a flavor can be nice. A thing that I started doing recently is so I have a somebody told me that one of their favorite coffee shops in Madison creates a rose mocha. And a
Oh,
mocha, yeah, I know it sounds delicious, right? And it's
yeah.
the kind of thing where I think that would be too much sugar for me in the morning, but I wanted to see what I could
Mhm.
do. So I got a bag of like food grade rose petals and I tried putting them in cold brew, and that was pretty good. And lately, what I've been doing is I will put them in the French press with my coffee grounds, and it makes like a little bit
Mm.
of a rose, adds a little bit of rose flavor to the black
Sure.
coffee, which is really nice.
Interesting. I never thought of that. No, I know what you mean. As I was reflecting back on Super Bowl commercials, I thought the one with Affleck in it was funny, but then I think to myself, yeah, that's not really coffee. I mean, every time I've tried to have coffee from Dunkin's, I'm just like, what is this? What? And then I realized that nearly anybody who says I love Dunkin's and it's the best coffee I've ever had, ask them what their order is, because it isn't just coffee or it isn't just a latte. It's 6 pumps of this and 5 pumps of that and 7 sugars and a gallon of cream. It's like, oh, okay, it's
Mhm.
to quote Ted Lasso, give me anything with caffeine in it that doesn't have a hint of coffee, and it's like, yeah, that's not kind of the point. So,
Right.
oh, Glenn wants to know, are you a coffee all day person or just in the morning?
Ooh, so this is an interesting question because at one point I put on my, um, I've put on some professional profiles that if you hand me a coffee at just the right time, it like really means a lot to me. And
Mhm.
most of the time people skip over that. But on occasion, I have found myself in a bind where somebody will bring me an absolutely delicious looking latte at like 4 in the afternoon. And I know that if I drink that thing, I'm going to
Mhm.
be up all night because my caffeine
Right.
tolerance, I used to do before the pandemic, I was one coffee on training days, on weight training days. And
Sure.
then on the other days, I would do like tea or something like that. And during the pandemic, I decided I was going to treat myself. And so now it doesn't really matter whether I'm weight training that day or not. I'll have a coffee. But it generally tends to be 1 in the morning, and then if I'm going out to like a nice coffee shop or something like that in the afternoon, then I'll go decaf at the time, which I
Sure.
understand ruins the entire premise because decaf is sort of categorically not as good as the caffeinated coffee a lot of times when it comes to taste, and it's maybe silly to pay $5 for a latte with that in it.
Hmm.
But it's a way to participate in the ritual and the experience of the coffee without over caffeinating myself. For the amount
Hmm.
that I talk about coffee, I would say that I do not drink that much.
Sure, sure. Well, it's all relative. There's no getting around that. I remember working with a person early in my career who said that he was really cutting down and he was only drinking like a pot and a half of coffee a day because he used to drink at least 2 pots of coffee every day. And he was one of these people where if you were in a meeting with him, his leg was just vibrating the entire time. And like the table would be moving, and you're like, you may want to cut back just a smidge,
Mhm.
just a little bit there, my friend. And so I do need to quote fuel here. It doesn't mean a latte to you. So well done.
Oh,
Well done.
so funny. The reason I got
Well
into
played.
programming, actually, I lied at the beginning of this whole podcast. I got into it because people are so good at puns in this industry that I just could
There
not
you go.
imagine myself surviving without a punny workforce like that.
Right, right. So I guess Fuel says also alcohol-free beer is getting very good. I used to think alcohol-free beer couldn't be good. Yeah, no, I mean anything can be good if it's done right, my opinion. But oh my gosh, yeah, we could easily spend another hour talking about coffee. But I know you have better things to do than just hang out with me here on Twitch. So Gothenburg, I've been there. Oh, we can't control ourselves really. Oh, that's fair. That's fair. I guess I didn't realize it was the pun city, but I'm gonna let you. I'll have to take your word for it there, ugly snout. So
Maybe they'll
I
have a
won't.
con there and we can go or something like that.
There was an event that I did for a few years that was, I'm blanking on the name of it, but it was one of the first international trips I did as a like working adult was Gothenburg, Sweden, and I will say that part of the world's much nicer to be in like May, June than it is in February, March.
Understandable.
But to each their own. To each their own. All right. Well, if people want to get more information from you, they can obviously go to your website so we can check that out. And of course, we've got the new course. I would love to get into it about technical debt too, because I think that's another topic you and I could probably talk about for a good hour and a half. But I know it's already late afternoon. Yeah, November. Don't recommend that either. Yeah, I agree with you. There's no getting around that. But darkness plus raining sideways. But yeah, that's not good. That's not good at all. And well, thanks, Simon. I'm glad you enjoyed it. That's good to know. Always nice when folks interact. This is a lot more fun for me when folks, as our wonderful viewers here, have been chiming in. It gives me interesting things to dive off on. But thank you so much for hanging out with me. I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. We'll be back next week, and till then, we'll talk to you later. Cheers, everybody.